The United Nations General Assembly is one of the 6 principal organs of the United Nations and the only one in which all member nations have equal representation. Its powers are to oversee the budget of the United Nations, appoint the non-permanent members to the Security Council, receive reports from other parts of the United Nations and make recommendations in the form of General Assembly resolutions. It has also established a wide number of subsidiary organs. The General Assembly meets under its President as Secretary-General in regular yearly sessions, the main part of which lasts from September to December and resumed part from January until all issues are addressed. It can also reconvene for special and emergency special sessions. Its composition, functions, powers, voting, and procedures are set out in Chapter 4 of the United Nations Charter. The first session was convened on the 10th of January 1946 in the Westminster Central Hall in London and included representatives of 51 nations, voting in the General Assembly on important questions, namely, recommendations on peace and security, budgetary concerns and the election, admission, suspension or expulsion of members, is by a 2/3 majority of those present and voting. Other questions are decided by a straightforward majority. Each member country has one vote, apart from approval of budgetary matters, including adoption of a scale of assessment. Assembly resolutions are not binding on the members. The Assembly may make recommendations on any matters within the scope of the UN, except matters of peace and security under Security Council consideration. The one state, one vote power structure potentially allows states comprising just 5% of the world population to pass a resolution by a 2/3 vote. During the 1980s, the Assembly became a forum for the North-South dialogue, the discussion of issues between industrialized nations and developing countries. These issues came to the fore because of the phenomenal growth and changing makeup of the UN membership. In 1945, the UN had 51 members. It now has 193, of which more than 2/3 are developing countries. Because of the numbers, developing countries are often able to determine the agenda of the Assembly, the character of its debates, and the nature of its decisions. For many developing countries, the UN is the source of much of their diplomatic influence and the principal outlet for the foreign relations initiatives. Although the resolutions passed by the General Assembly do not have the binding forces over the member nations, pursuant to its Uniting for Peace resolution of November 1950, the Assembly may also take action if the Security Council fails to act, owing to the negative vote of a permanent member in a case where there appears to be a threat to the peace, breach of the peace or act of aggression. The Assembly can consider the matter immediately with a view to making recommendations to members for collective measures to maintain or restore international peace and security. History. The first session of the UN General Assembly was convened on the 10th of January 1946 in the Westminster Central Hall in London and included representatives of 51 nations. The next few annual sessions were held in different cities, the second session in New York, and the third session was in Paris. It moved to the permanent United Nations headquarters in New York at the start of its 7th regular annual session, on the 14th of October 1952. In December 1988, in order to hear Yasser Arafat, the General Assembly organized its 29th session in the Palace of Nations, in Geneva. Membership. All 193 members states of the United Nations are members of the General Assembly. Further, the United Nations General Assembly may grant observer status to an international organization, entity, and non-member state. which entitles the entity to participate in the work of the United Nations General Assembly, though with limitations. Agenda. The agenda for each session is planned up to 7 months in advance and begins with the release of a preliminary list of items to be included in the provisional agenda. This is refined into a provisional agenda 60 days before the opening of the session. After the session begins, the final agenda is adopted in a plenary meeting which allocates the work to the various main committees who later submit reports back to the Assembly for adoption by consensus or by vote. Items on the agenda are numbered. Regular plenary sessions of the General Assembly in recent years have initially been scheduled to be held over the course of just 3 months. However, additional workloads have extended these sessions to last on through just short of the next session. The routinely scheduled portions of the sessions are normally scheduled to commence on the Tuesday of the 3rd week in September, counting from the first week that contains at least one working day as per the UN Rules of Procedure. The last 2 of these regular sessions were routinely scheduled to recess exactly 3 months afterwards in early December, but were resumed in January and extended on until just before the beginning of the following sessions. Resolutions. The General Assembly votes on many resolutions brought forth by sponsoring states. These are generally statements symbolizing the sense of the international community about an array of world issues. Most General Assembly resolutions are not enforceable as a legal or practical matter, because the General Assembly lacks enforcement powers with respect to most issues. The General Assembly has authority to make final decisions in some areas such as the United Nations budget. General Assembly resolutions are generally non-binding on member states, but carry considerable political weight, and are legally binding towards the operations of the General Assembly. The General Assembly can also refer an issue to the Security Council to put in place a binding resolution. UN budget. The General Assembly also approves the budget of the United Nations, and decides how much money each member state must pay to run the organization. The Charter of the United Nations gives responsibility for approving the budget to the General Assembly and for preparing the budget to the Secretary General, as Chief Administrative Officer. The Charter also addresses the non-payment of assessed contributions. The planning, programming, budgeting, monitoring and evaluation cycle of the United Nations has evolved over the years. Major resolutions on the process include General Assembly Resolutions 41 213ths of the 19th of December 1986, 42 211ths of the 21st of December 1987, and 45 248ths of the 21st of December 1990. The budget covers the costs of United Nations programs in areas such as political affairs, international justice and law, international cooperation for development, public information, human rights and humanitarian affairs. The main source of funds for the regular budget is the contributions of member states. The scale of assessments is based on the capacity of countries to pay. This is determined by considering the relative shares of total gross national product, adjusted to take into account a number of factors, including the per capita incomes. In addition to the regular budget, member states are assessed for the costs of the international tribunals and, in accordance with a modified version of the basic scale, for the costs of peacekeeping operations. Resolution numbering scheme. For the 1st to the 30th General Assembly sessions, all General Assembly resolutions were numbered consecutively, with the resolution number followed by the session number in Roman numbers, which was the 1514th numbered resolution adopted by the Assembly, and was adopted at the 15th regular session. Beginning in the 31st session, resolutions are numbered by individual session. Elections. The General Assembly votes in elections for the 10 non-permanent members of the United Nations Security Council. The most recent such election was on the 6th of December 2013. These elections take place every year. A member state served 2-year terms, with 5 replaced each year. The candidates are selected by the regional groups. The General Assembly also elects members of the United Nations Economic and Social Council. It also elects members of the United Nations Industrial Development Organization and some members of the United Nations Trusteeship Council. The General Assembly appoints the Secretary-General of the United Nations on recommendation of the Security Council, and adopts rules governing the administration of the Secretariat. Along with the Security Council, the General Assembly elects judges for the International Court of Justice in The Hague. Special sessions. Special sessions may be convened at the request of the United Nations Security Council, or a majority of UN members, or, if the majority concurs, of a single member. A special session was held on October 1995 at the head of government level to commemorate the UN's 50th anniversary. Another special session was held in September 2000 to celebrate the millennium. It put forward the Millennium Development Goals. A special session was again held to discuss and admit proposals for the HIV/AIDS crisis in 2001. A further special session was held in September 2005 to commemorate the UN's 60th anniversary. It assessed progress on the Millennium Development Goals, and discussed Kofi Annan's Enlarger Freedom proposals. Another special session was held in 2014 to discuss population and development, following the International Conference on Population and Development Programme of Action. A further special session was held in 2016, this time on the discussion of the war on drugs and proposals to reconsider international drug treaties, like the Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs, as well as how to deal with drug treatment, rehabilitation, etc. The first UN gathering on the subject in 20 years. In 2016, while some European and South American countries as well as the U.S. favored softer approaches, countries such as China and Russia and most Muslim nations like Iran, Indonesia and Pakistan remained staunchly opposed to any move beyond prohibition. One group favoring reform, the Global Commission on Drug Policy, and some attendees expressed disappointment with the status quo outcome. Other special sessions. At the first special session of the UN General Assembly held in 1947, Osvaldo Arana, then president of the special session, began a tradition that has remained until today, whereby the first speaker at this major international forum is always a Brazilian. If the Security Council fails to act to maintain international peace and security due to a disagreement between its permanent members, the General Assembly has the power to convene an emergency special session and act to ensure peace and security under United Nations General Assembly Resolution 377. General debates. Annually, heads of state, government or heads of delegations speak at the opening of the new session of the General Assembly during the general debate. The 70th session of the United Nations General Assembly opened on the 15th of September 2015. The President of the United Nations General Assembly is, for the Western European and others group, subsidiary organs. The General Assembly subsidiary organs are divided into 5 categories: committees, commissions, boards, councils and panels, working groups, and other committees. Main committees. The main committees are ordinally numbered 1 to 6. The first committee, Disarmament and International Security. The second committee, Economic and Financial. The third committee, Social, Cultural and Humanitarian. The fourth committee, Special Political and Decolonization. The 5th Committee, Administrative and Budgetary and General. The 6th Committee, Legal. The roles of many of the main committees have changed over time. Until the late 1970s, the first committee was the Political and Security Committee, and there was also a sufficient number of additional political matters that an additional, unnumbered main committee, called the Special Political Committee, also sat. The 4th Committee formerly handled trusteeship and decolonization matters, with the decreasing number of such matters to be addressed as the trust territories attained independence and the decolonization movement progressed. The functions of the Special Political Committee were merged into the 4th Committee during the 1990s. Each main committee consists of all the members of the General Assembly. Each elects a chairman, 3 vice-chairmen, and a rapporteur at the outset of each regular General Assembly session. Other committees, these are not numbered. According to the General Assembly website, the most important are Credentials Committee. This committee is charged with ensuring that the diplomatic credentials of all UN representatives are in order. The Credentials Committee consists of 9 member states elected early in each regular General Assembly session. General Committee. This is a supervisory committee entrusted with ensuring that the whole meeting of the Assembly goes smoothly. The General Committee consists of the President and Vice Presidents of the current General Assembly session and the chairman of each of the 6 main committees. Other committees of the General Assembly are enumerated. Commissions. There are 6 commissions. Disarmament Commission, established by GAR Resolution 502 and S-10 International Civil Service Commission, established by GAR Resolution 3357. International Law Commission, established by GAR Resolution 174. United Nations Commission on International Trade Law, established by GAR Resolution 2205. United Nations Conciliation Commission for Palestine, established by GAR Resolution 194. United Nations Peacebuilding Commission, established by GAR Resolution 6180 and UN Security Council Resolutions 1645 and 1646. Despite its name, the former United Nations Commission on Human Rights was actually a subsidiary body of ECOSOC. Boards. There are 7 boards which are categorized into 2 groups: A. Executive Boards and B. Boards. Executive Boards. Executive Board of the United Nations Children's Fund, Executive Board of the United Nations Development Programme and of the United Nations Population Fund, Executive Board of the World Food Programme. Boards. Board of Auditors, Trade and Development Board, United Nations Joint Staff Pension Board, Advisory Board on Disarmament Matters. Councils and panels. The newest council is the United Nations Human Rights Council, which replaced the aforementioned UNCHR in March 2006. There are a total of 4 councils and 1 panel. Working groups and other. There is a varied group of working groups and other subsidiary bodies. Seating. Countries are seated alphabetically in the General Assembly according to English translations of the countries' names. However, the country which occupies the frontmost left position is rotated annually by lot. One country is balloted each year to sit in the frontmost left position, and the remaining countries follow alphabetically behind it. Reform and UNPA. On the 21st of March 2005, Secretary General Kofi Annan presented a report in Larger Freedom that criticized the General Assembly for focusing so much on consensus that it was passing watered-down resolutions reflecting the lowest common denominator of widely different opinions. Quote, he also criticized the Assembly for trying to address too broad an agenda, instead of focusing on the major substantive issues of the day. such as international migration and the long-debated Comprehensive Convention on Terrorism. Annan recommended streamlining the General Assembly's agenda, committee structure, and procedures, strengthening the role and authority of its president, enhancing the role of civil society, and establishing a mechanism to review the decisions of its committees, in order to minimize unfunded mandates and micromanagement at the United Nations Secretariat. Annan reminded UN members of the responsibility to implement reforms if they expect to realize improvements in UN effectiveness. The reform proposals were not taken up by the United Nations World Summit in September 2005. Instead, the summit solely affirmed the central position of the General Assembly as the chief deliberative, policy-making and representative organ of the United Nations, as well as the role of the Assembly in the process of standards setting and the codification of international law. The summit also called for strengthening the relationship between the General Assembly and the other principal organs to ensure better coordination on topical issues that required coordinated action by the United Nations. In accordance with the respective mandates, a United Nations Parliamentary Assembly, or United Nations People's Assembly, is a proposed addition to the United Nations system that eventually could allow for direct election of UN Parliament members by citizens all over the world. In the general debate of the 65th General Assembly, George Valero, representing Venezuela, said, "The United Nations has exhausted its model and it is not simply a matter of proceeding with reform. The 21st century demands deep changes that are only possible with a rebuilding of this organization." Quote. He pointed to the futility of resolutions concerning the Cuban embargo and the Middle East conflict as reasons for the UN model having failed. Venezuela also called for the suspension of veto rights in the Security Council because it was a remnant of the Second World War is incompatible with the principle of sovereign equality of states. Reform of the United Nations General Assembly includes proposals to change the powers and composition of the UN General Assembly. This could include, for example, tasking the UNGA with evaluating how well member states implement UNGA resolutions, increasing the power of the Assembly vis-à-vis the United Nations Security Council, or making debates more constructive and less repetitive.